So I want to start off today's podcast with by thinking a little bit about. I want you to think about a question I have posed for you. So, in 1985, IBM was America's most valuable company and one of its most profitable and among its largest employers, with a payroll of nearly 400,000. And today, NVIDIA is nearly 20 times as valuable and 5 times as profitable as IBM was back then, adjusted for inflation. Yet it employs a tenth as many people. So that simple comparison, I think, says something profound about today's economy. The rewards are largely going to capital instead of labor. So profits have soared since the pandemic, the market value attached to those profits even more. But the result is capital, which includes businesses, shareholders, superstar employees, is triumphant, while the average worker ekes out marginal gains. So I want you to think about that dichotomy there as we go through today's podcast. So welcome to the Big Three from the Coalition for a Prosperous America, where each week we break down the three biggest stories shaping U.S. trade, industrial policy, and the American economy. My name is Mihir Torsekar, and alongside my fellow senior economist, Andrew Reschenberg, we are here to talk to you about the Big Three. So let's get to it. So this week, I thought, the background, the kind of context in which we came up with today's show is set behind the backdrop of a debate that I recently did at the Ohio State University with the Tax Foundation. And we were talking about the question about, are tariffs just? So that debate, as I saw it, kind of usually gets framed around the argument about efficiency. We don't really ever ask the question about, does tariff policy, is it a just economic outcome? We think about often, does tariff policy or trade policy deliver the cheapest goods to Americans? But this was a really interesting discussion. And I think the reason I thought, Andrew and I were talking before the show, talking about this might be a good show to have because, out of that discussion came three big points that we want to focus on. So I think first, it might make sense to talk about the affordability crisis because, tariffs and trade policy gets set against that backdrop. So let's start with affordability because I think it's the through line for everything else. The conventional, frame treats this as a price problem, like there's too much demand, sticky inflation, supply shocks. But the demand or the data tells a different story, right? So since 2000, the cost of things that define middle class life, like housing, healthcare, child care, has risen by nearly 170%. But tradable goods, the stuff we actually import, has gotten cheaper over the same period. So Americans got cheaper TVs and more expensive lives at the same time, and the crisis that people are actually feeling is a wage crisis, and trade policy sits at the center of it. So Andrew, question for you, right? If essential services are what's outpacing wages, what does trade policy have to do with it? Aren't those non-tradable parts of the economy? I want to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that there's two main issues that are going on here with cost of living, especially for just the cost of goods that Americans are spending. Number one is that the goods that are rising in prices fastest aren't related to tariffs and aren't related to trade in general. So, for example, shelter is one of the biggest leading causes for inflation, and that's risen about 3% in the past year. This is one of the bigger drivers, and it's also the biggest portion of Americans' spending. So the thing you're spending the most on is shelter. That is what drives your spending. And it's also increasing faster than a lot of these traded goods. And same thing with things like medical care services. That's up 3.7% in the past year. That's also really driving this inflation. But when you look at areas that are related to trade and are related to tariffs, this really isn't driving the inflation picture. Number one, as you may have pointed out, that these aren't really the things Americans are spending the most amount of money on. So even if you have a cheaper TV, is your TV going to offset a higher cost in rent? Oh, basically never. And so these tradable manufactured goods just aren't a high portion of Americans' expenditure, and they're also not rising quickly. So for example, you take commodities minus food and energy. This is just your basic manufactured goods that you'd get at Walmart or any other store that you'd go get any of these items at. It's only risen 1.2% in the past year, which is about half the amount as the overall inflation numbers. And then you take also different goods that might be a bit higher percentage of the income and where tariffs are actually playing an impact. So for example, new motor vehicles. We just had a Section 232 tariff on motor vehicles that was started last year. And so this is now tariffed. It's highly related to trade. You would expect this one to be one of the most impacted areas for inflation. But new vehicle prices inflation was only up half a percentage point in the past year. And so we're really just not seeing this connection. And I think we're actually even seeing this being recognized by the major economists in the US. For example, the Minneapolis Fed just posted a brief study showing that, and the very title of this word for word was tariffs cannot explain rising goods inflation. And this is really just coming down to a growing realization that when you look at the actual goods that are tariffed and the corresponding inflation rates, we're not seeing this connect. And a lot of the studies that have come out to this point that are linking tariffs to inflation has been purely hypothetical, basically just taking the estimated on paper, on theory tariff rates and measuring a 100% price impact and saying that, oh, in theory, this would result in 3% price gains. But we're not actually seeing those 3% price gains. And so I think that this is a really big realization, especially now coming from the Federal Reserve, on what exactly is happening with inflation, what are the primary drivers. And I think if you're an average American, you can kind of see this in reality, like where are your biggest costs rising? Where are you actually spending the most money? As if you go to see a lot of these sticker prices at the store, some things might be getting more expensive, but you really have to ask yourself, is this related to trade? And is this where most of my money is going? Or is it on higher electricity prices, especially with all the oil disruptions, or higher rents because of housing shortages? These are really the areas that are affecting Americans the most.
It's, when they talk about the K-shaped economy that we're experiencing, and this is why sometimes these conversations, folks are just talking past each other, because on the one end, if you're doing well, you're doing really well. If you're in some of those, high productivity service sectors like tech, finance, professional services, if you're on Wall Street or Silicon Valley, for example, you're doing really well, right? If you're invested in the stock market, you're doing well, you're feeling the wealth effect. And some of these costs might be high, the services costs we mentioned, but you can manage it because your wages are high, for example. But those high wages in those select sectors are drawing up, they're buoying up the cost of those services, those non-tradable services that I mentioned, like the healthcare and things like that. But, those are industries that, are, like I said, non-tradable, but they're also characterized by low productivity gains. Like, so for example, the same time it taught an instructor to teach a violin lesson 30 years ago is the same as it is now, versus the time it takes to treat a patient in the healthcare sector is roughly the same as it was before. Yet nevertheless, those wages are being brought up by, those other sectors that are performing really well as far as like wage growth. And so, yeah, when some folks get out there and they say, well, GDP is doing great and all of these, the stock market's doing so well, that doesn't resonate to the people who aren't invested in the stock market. Like 90% of the stock market, I think, 90% or 10% of the population is invested in 90% of the stock market, or some statistic like that. Basically, the gains of the market are not redounding to the rest of the economy. So I think that is part of what is missing in this discussion. And you're right. I think when people see that costs of living are high, and then they compare that with what they're hearing about tariffs raising costs and how it's inflationary and a lot of misinformation, it's hard to understand why they feel a little bit of, resistance to the idea of tariffs. But yeah, I think when I looked at the numbers, even just a couple months ago, goods, I should say, which are subject to tariffs, were responsible for like 0.2% of overall inflation numbers. So, and again, Andrew, this well. You did some work on looking at what's causing beef prices to rise, and that's obviously been a big hit on our website, because yeah, I mean that's not a tariff issue, right? That's a whole separate issue about like the consolidation of meat packers and things like that. So, even when people see costs increase at the grocery store, it's not necessarily a reflection of tariffs, but it's just easy to say like, oh, this is entirely tariffs. So maybe why don't we turn it to you to have you talk a little bit about the employment trends, and we'll pick up from there.
Yeah, and I think you started hitting on some of these points already, but the second main point that we wanted to talk about is within this tariff discussion, also the idea that free trade has been a tide that rises all ships, that like as the pie gets bigger, the economic pie, that everyone benefits by this because of lower goods prices, and that this is really going to lift the whole economy up. But this is actually the exact opposite of what we've been seeing. It's been really disproportional gains. And as you were getting at, if you're at the very top, you're seeing the stock market continue to increase, you're seeing your salary being able to outpace a lot of even the service inflation that's happening, you might be thinking that things are doing really well. But if you talk to the average American who is really bearing the cost of this cost of living crisis, that everything is not okay. The rising tide has not been lifting all ships. And there's two main issues here. Number one has been the employment aspect. And if you look at studies of what trade liberalization with China has done, and we talked about this with our comments for revoking China's PNTR status, that import competition with China has resulted in 2 to 2.4 million jobs displaced in the United States in the early 2000s. And this has had ripple effects across entire economic regions in the US. And it's not just these 2 to 2.4 million jobs. It's all the jobs that are also supported by those industries. It's the local school districts, it's the local restaurants. And that's why you have this, not only the closure of factories across the Midwest, but the broader economic collapse that came with it. And another great example of this change that we've had with trade liberalization is just looking at the income inequality within the US and how real wages have failed to keep pace with productivity. Since 2000 till today, Americans have produced 65% more. Their productivity has risen 65%. But the real actual income for these Americans, the actual median wages, has increased just by 23%. And so there's this huge gap. And we can also see this in a huge study done by the Rand Corporation, where they found that if we had the same income distribution levels, the same distribution of how much the top percents make versus the average American from 1975, we would have the bottom 90% of Americans be making $3.9 trillion more in 2023 alone. And just to put this in real terms, that would mean that every American in the bottom 90% would be making $1,000 more per month and be able to have much, much higher incomes with this amount. That's $1,000 per month per American in the bottom 90%. And that's just if we had the same income distribution levels as 1975. It wasn't that long ago. We weren't in a drastically different country back then. But all these economic changes that have happened over the past decades have really disproportionately benefited the very top of society, and trade has definitely been within that picture. And we're seeing not only these good middle-class job losses, but all the jobs that are supported by them, people being forced into lower-wage service sector jobs, and we're seeing those wages also being able to not keep pace with inflation. And really, we've had these broad economic consequences from trade that really haven't been rectified and really haven't been recognized up until very recently. And even then, it's still a battle, of course.
Well, I think it's clear. It's important to draw a distinction between, when we look at the manufacturing sector, excuse me, I hit my mic. Not all job losses are the same in the manufacturing sector. And I think this is an important distinction to draw upon because, when they look at, I've seen some interviews that folks have done on YouTube, for example, where they show manufacturing employment kind of trending downward from the 1940s onward. But, you got to distinguish between productivity losses manufacturing jobs that are the result of productivity gains, right? Which is actually a good thing. You don't want just random people, grabbing a shovel and, shoveling up the ground to try to for some ambitious construction project. Yeah, sure, you can employ people, but you're not really getting a whole lot done when you can actually have an automated, earth moving equipment or something like that, right? But we got to distinguish between that kind of displacement or lost jobs, if you will, versus, the kind of jobs that are just simply displaced. And if you look in the manufacturing sector, it's actually not a story of productivity gains that are just spiking. It's stagnation. And especially from, the period of the high point in 2007 to now, it's almost been a complete flat line. We've never actually reached back up to those peaks that we achieved in the middle part of the decade. So, that tells me that's, again, largely a displacement story. And I think that this focus on consumer welfare above all else and say, oh, well, we just need to get consumers the cheapest good possible. But if you're locked into a situation where your wages have stagnated and you have no choice but to choose the cheapest option because it's about survival for you, it's not just because I have the choice. You don't have a choice. You are essentially forced into a situation where you have the lowest, option. So yeah, I think we need to address those issues as well. Because again, we're not trying to get unemployed, or we're not trying to just boost employment for the sake of it, just to have our numbers look good and feel good about ourselves. We're actually trying to get productive employment going, and create a more balanced economy. And I think you need to do that by, creating meaningful work and opportunities for people. Because yeah, you've mentioned before the multiplier effect for manufacturing jobs. It's not just one job, and you go home. It's a job that, patronizes other local businesses and actually buoys the service economy as well. Like it undergirds the entire economy, right? So, and again, I think these are kind of discussions that often get lost in this whole, in this whole discussion. But why don't we pivot maybe to the third segment? Talk a little bit about investment trends and onshoring.
Yeah, this is the third big part of the tariff conversation that really needs to be discussed and solidified, is that we have this opposition talk that tariffs don't even work, that the stated goal of tariffs to bring manufacturing back to the U.S., they don't even work for that, where we're not seeing any evidence of that. But when you look at the actual data, the first indicators that you would look to see whenever you are reshoring this manufacturing, we are really seeing these first signs. So, for example, for just manufacturing demand in the U.S., durable goods orders rose 8.2% in 2025. This is signaling that people are having more demand for U.S.-made goods. These orders are increasing. The ISM manufacturing PMI, which measures if manufacturing is expanding or contracting in the economy, hit 52.7% in March, and this is the third consecutive month that it's been increasing. And then I think another really good data point that we're starting to see now is manufacturing labor productivity. And this is something that is also going to really tie back into the inflation numbers, because as we manufacture more here in the U.S., our productivity, the actual output that we are able to do per person, is going to increase with economies of scale as we produce things more in mass. And it's a lot cheaper to make 100 of a product per unit than it is to make 10 of a product per unit. And so as our output increases, our manufacturing costs are going to go down and this productivity is going to rise. And we're already seeing that. In 2025, manufacturing labor productivity rose 1.9%. And this is the largest annual gain since 2010. And so this is a big increasing trend, and it will also really impact the inflation going forward as it becomes cheaper to make things in the U.S. as we make more of them, just with these economies of scale. And the final thing I will also add is that we're also seeing these same sort of trends in our CPA domestic market share index, which increased 3.5% in 2025. And this is partly due to some of the import levels decreasing since early 2025 and late 2024 into the third quarter. But it's also actually tied to output rising in many of these key industries, especially ones that are linked to Section 232. For primary metals, for example, actual output is up significantly, and same with motor vehicles. We had a $2.9 billion increase, $3.3 billion increase in primary metals gross output, and for motor vehicles, the output was up by an equally high amount of 4.8%. And so we're seeing many of these indicators actually go up in time and making significant impacts for the U.S. economy, that we're actually producing more, our per unit costs are going down, and these are the very early indicators. We're definitely not completely reshored yet. We've had decades of damage, as we've previously talked about, but these are very positive early signals that if we continue along lines of good tariff protection with specific product and industry level tariffs that are tailored for these industries and give these long-term price signals, if tariffs are done right, they can give this huge positive boost and positive investment signal for investing in American production and American industry.
Yeah, a couple of points I'll make on that is, number one, the numbers, as you point, trend in the right direction. And this is the larger point of tariffs. Sometimes I think that gets lost about, when people are talking about who's paying for the tariff and all these things. But sure, there are instances where consumer goods or the cost that consumers pay will rise slightly, at least. But the point is you're trying to adjust the incentives away from consumption to production. And that's, you're trying to induce investment to come online. Looking at just estimated capital expenditures that, again, these are largely based off of announcements, so that haven't necessarily materialized, but it's all trending in the right direction. I think this administration is actually credited with having the highest amount of estimated capital expenditures forecast over this, period so far, as far as the second term has been going for the Trump administration. But I'll also point out, as you mentioned, we're talking about like 40 plus years of deindustrialization. This didn't just happen over time. China didn't go from producing like 5% of the world's manufacturing output in 2000 to 35%, today. Well, that didn't happen overnight. 25, 26 years of them just methodically chipping away at the foundation. And I think the other point I'll make is that, one of the things that concerns me is the lack of commitment, I think, to, whether it's across successive administrations or, just even within the given administration to just like outline and enunciate a policy, but then kind of chip back at it, right? So you announce tariffs on Section 232 tariffs. We need a protective wall for our industrial base. And then you subsequently start to use it as leverage, so to speak, for, negotiations. Okay, we get them into the negotiation table, and then we're just going to wipe that tariff away and carve out these holes in the whole apparatus to just Swiss cheese this bad boy. And all of a sudden, like, your effective tariff rate is just plunged again. And so how committed are you to this policy? Whereas you don't have that question in China. I mean, for right or wrong, right? Regardless of their industrial overcapacity is destroying their own economy. It's creating problems for themselves, but they're still, I'll give them that, they're committed. They're going to go down this path. And I feel like, again, I feel like we are very, it's hard to know that we're committed and that we're in this for the long haul. And it's tough for investment as an investment signal. Like, who wants to commit resources to projects that just could be mothballed by the next administration? So I really want us to be able to, like, I really wish we could be in a situation where we could just, have that focus, and just know that we're in this for the long term. It just feels like that's been lacking. Maybe that's a good place to stop. I don't know if you had any other thoughts you wanted to offer, Andrew, before we wrap up.
Yeah, the only other thought I wanted to say was what kind of inspired us to do this sort of overview of the major points in the tariff debate recently is your actual debate, Mihir, your debate at Ohio State University just a few weeks ago. And it was really great to see. And yeah, congratulations on the debate. It's really, especially as this debate gets more and more public, for how effective are tariffs doing the things that they're saying they're doing? Are they affecting inflation? I think that these are the core questions. And so we really wanted to just outline the main points in this debate and also just congratulate you on how the debate went.
I appreciate that. And, it kind of reminds me back when you testified, I think in the Senate Aging Committee, right? The experience you had where you're essentially leaning into the facts and the analysis and the work that you've done. I had much the same experience where the kind of reception I got was very, it wasn't like this partisan kind of bickering. It was very much well received because I think people in the end, as much as we talk about everything just divided, polarization, tribalism, all that stuff, in the end, I think people want to know that they're getting the right information, and they want to be able to just make independent decisions just with the right information. So I think it's probably, to our credit maybe, that the kind of work that we're doing, and that's why I think it's awesome to be a part of an organization that we're kind of pushing forward on that. So I think that's great that I had that opportunity to do it. And so, appreciate your comments. But I think that's a good place for us to wrap up. You can learn more about the work that we do at prosperousamerica.org. Be sure to find us on YouTube or Spotify or wherever you get your podcast. Until the next time, stay tuned. Take care.